Merci beaucoup, Marie-Ève. Merci beaucoup à tous qui êtes venus. Merci beaucoup à Federico Pagello, que j'ai l'honneur et l'avantage de vous présenter. J'ai un peu l'impression qu'on est dans... Ça va? Tu arrives à voir comme ça?
Oui, simplement. On a du monde à distance.
Ah oui, d'accord, oui, très bien. Voilà. Comme ça, je suis à côté de Federico. Ben, c'est encore mieux. Comme ça, on est tout près. Comme ça, on a l'impression qu'on est dans l'éducation sentimentale. Quand Frédéric et Deslauriers se retrouvent toujours réunis par la fatalité de leur caractère et de leur destin. Et ils ne peuvent pas. Alors, c'est un peu l'impression que j'ai avec Federico, qui va nous parler aujourd'hui, depuis de nombreuses années, qui va nous parler aujourd'hui de docu-series as True Crime Serial in the Case of SanPa. Donc, des séries qui sont à l'articulation du documentaire et de la fiction, des séries qu'on trouve sur Netflix, sur Amazon Prime et des séries italiennes. Alors, il y a une étude de cas, c'est SanPa. Federico, donc, qu'on ne présente plus, mais que je vais quand même présenter pour les gens qui seraient en ligne ou qui sont en ligne, est professeur assistant en Media Studies à l'Université d'Annunzio de Chieti Pescara. Il a coordonné le projet Detect, comme nous le savons tous. Sa recherche se focalise sur la circulation de la culture populaire en Europe et sur les imaginaires du crime. Je traduis de l'anglais là, parce que je pense qu'on est face à un public francophone. Je ne sais pas exactement les gens en ligne. Alors je vois Caius, francophone. Il a publié 2 monographies, Grattacieli et Super Uomini, l'imaginaire de la città fra cinemata e fumetto. Donc, c'est sur Spider-Man, en fait, hein, le titre ne le dit pas. Et puis, Quentin Tarantino, and Film Theory, Aesthetics and Dialectic in Late Postmodernity. Donc, sur le cinéma de Quentin Tarantino et la théorie postmoderne. Il a récemment édité ou coédité deux numéros spéciaux liés au sujet de ce colloque. Locality and Cosmopolitanism in European Crime Narratives, pour le journal of Academic Quarter, pour le journal Academic Quarter, et puis Local Detectives, Cultural Diversity in European TV Crime Dramas, pour le journal Cinéma et compagnie. Voilà, Federico. Alors, les consignes sont strictes. On va essayer d'avoir 45 minutes, y compris la discussion. Hein. On va essayer de ne pas déborder des 45 minutes. C'est le brief. Si, voilà. Merci beaucoup. À toi.
Est-ce que je peux faire ça? C'est un problème.
Est-ce que ça marche hein, si tu...
Oui, je pense que oui. Alors, as my title makes clear, I hope, in this paper I will look at the phenomenon that has become more and more popular in the contemporary mediascape from a particular angle, the relationship between the form of the docu-series and that of the crime serial. The fact that in the last few years, the true crime genre has become an increasingly visible and legitimate genre in contemporary TV and online popular culture cannot come as a surprise for fans, critics, and scholars of serial crime narratives. The connection between serial narratives and reports about real crimes is indeed a very long story, as we all know in this room. Today, I will therefore look at the docu-series of case studies and hopefully as a good starting point for a new, larger project that I'm beginning to work on in this moment. In this project, I intend to explore the relationship between seriality and crime narratives from both a theoretical and a historical perspective. In my presentation, I will share with you some of the premises of this broader project, elaborating a few preliminary hypotheses about some key features of serial crime narratives in general, and the contemporary true crime docu-series in particular. After highlighting 4 key aspects of the connection between seriality and crime narratives, I will focus on the recent true crime docu-series in the specific context of contemporary television and digital media. Finally, I will briefly look into the specific case of SanPa, an Italian docu-series produced by Netflix, which obtained a surprising success and provoked a wide debate in the country. SanPa is an interesting case of a docu-series that doesn't really fit in the true crime genre, and yet explicitly builds on the current popularity and style of true crime, not only to attract a wider audience, but also to effectively stimulate a debate on significant historical and political phenomena. As I said, I first of all highlight four main aspects in the relationship between seriality and crime narratives that I will take into consideration in my discussion of true crime docu-series. The first element is the ability of serial crime narratives, whether real or fictional, to adapt to any new media that has appeared in the last 2 centuries. This has been true, of course, since the emergence of modern periodicals, which have immediately exploited any kind of information linked to crime, criminal and policing activities to thread together pieces of news in a series of consistent stories, also hosting a new form of serialized novels, the feuilleton, that has immediately built on its proximity to reports of real crime events to augment their appeal on the public. As Marie-Ève Torrenti has reminded yesterday, the usual example of Université de Paris was always a perfect case in point, as it helped shaping the interest of the crime novel in presenting itself as an exploration of real society in the guise of a serialized, highly melodramatic fiction released according to the serial logic of the periodical press. The same has been true also for cinema, radio, comics, traditional television, and now non-linear online television and other audiovisual platforms that you can find on the internet. The newspaper, radio, and TV in particular have gone really far in increasing the sense of closeness and everydayness of the stories and characters that they stage, whether real or imaginary. More than crime cinema and the crime novel, therefore, these media have shown how this serialization of criminal events provide the audiences with an intensified familiarity with the protagonist, the settings, and the disturbingly attractive atmosphere of the lurid crime stories they tell. The second element, closely linked to the first, is that serial crime narratives always shown a very strong tendency to blur the line between real facts and fiction, unlike genres such as fantasy, science fiction, or horror, which are the other genres most often explored by contemporary serial narratives. This characteristic highlights the particularly strong connection between serial crime narratives and the industrial and commercial logic of the periodical press. As shown by the research conducted in the context of Numa Press and previously by Dominique Khalifa and Marie-Ève Torrenti on the 19th century press, and by Mathieu Letournay on early 20th century crime narratives, the bond between the crime genre and the modes of production, distribution, and consumption of the press have always been strong. Studies on the parallel history of journalism, popular magazine, and crime fiction show how the narrative structure, the linguistic choices, the iconography, and the audiovisual styles adopted by narrative and reports about crime have been shaped by the mutual exchanges between news media and literary fiction. Here I put the covers of True Crime magazine, which also Mathieu has mentioned yesterday, precisely comparing the covers of a true detective magazine and actually a pop crime fiction magazine, showing that they're absolutely the same. But besides these stylistic features, it is on the links between serialized fiction and accounts about real crimes that I want to focus my attention. The periodical press has always built on the possibility or the necessity to use strategies of narrative serialization to keep the audience passionate about the most recent crime cases. And this strategies was later adopted by any other media to come, from radio to television, from film, newsreels to podcasts. The third element is that in serial crime narratives, and particularly in true crime, the narration of the events per se is less crucial than another aspect, the representation of the figure, characteristics, and activities of the key characters, the criminal and the detective. As scholarship on literary, film, comics, and TV crime series have shown, these characteristics are the real center of any successful crime story. Crime narratives are based on events that are part of our everyday reality and that yet suddenly takes a violent, unexpected, and astonishing turn. In this process, a real mystery is generated, and while it deals with what happened, it primarily seems to focus on the people involved in these events. Who are these people? How could they do this? Did they really do this? Do we have enough evidence to put them in jail for the rest of their life? What if they are innocent? And what if they were put in jail for life, even if we are sure that they are actually victims of a plot? All of these questions at the center of the genre, all of these questions are at the center of the crime genre, and they become even more urgent and often impossible to answer when they refer to true crime stories. As Todorov pointed out in his classic study of detective fiction, the criminal can be seen as the author of the narrative, whereas the detective occupies a position that is close to the one of the reader. Thinking of the criminal as the origin of the story gives us very solid ground to understand some of the key issues of serial crime narratives as a whole, and true crime in particular. A criminal, and especially a murderer, is indeed the most fascinating figure to be placed as the protagonist of the narrative. As the study by the American literary scholar Mark Seltzer on serial killers has proven, books, films, and TV shows depicting these figures are focused on the description or even simply the words and images by and about these criminals. The widely popular interviews with serial killers, arguably the ultimate example of true crime, are not actually about what happened, but who committed the crime, why they did it, and how these people think, look, and speak. As scholars in TV studies such as Jason Mittel and my colleague Sarah Casoli have convincingly argued, the analysis of serial narratives in general should give much more attention to the character they stage than literary and film scholars have tended to be so far. It is indeed on the relationship between the audience and the characters charisma especially, that the loyalty of the public of any serial narrative is built and preserved. The fourth feature derives from all the previous one and refers to the specific kind of serialization adopted by serial crime narratives, particularly, although not exclusively, in the true crime genre. Following Mathieu Letourneu's book, Fictionnels, as well as Mark Seltzer's studies on both serial killers and true crime, I remind here once again how it is necessary to connect the process of serialization to the context of modern society and its industrial modes of production, distribution, and consumption. Industrial serial narratives can take a variety of forms. In the case of the crime genre, two main distinct serial forms are identifiable: the detective series, which usually focuses on the episodic format in which the hero solves one case in each episode, and the criminal serials, for instance, the gangster saga, in which a single story focused on his anti-heroic protagonist is broken down in different parts. As the protagonists of true crime are almost inevitable the criminals or the innocent people accused of crime, I want to stress that the privilege given to the second approach, the crime serial, has important consequences for my discourse. While in other genres and other forms of crime fiction, the role of serialization is primarily that of setting up a world populated by characters that can experience a virtually endless series of adventures, crime narratives focused on the criminal figure tend to have a defined and even uncertain ending. As I said, gangster sagas and the lives of serial killers, the narratives about the lives of serial killers, offer an ideal object for this kind of serial narratives, following the well-defined narrative arc or the life arc of their protagonist. The serialization consists in breaking down this trajectory, expanding the number of detailed, perspective, and unexpected side stories. Crucially, not everything will be entirely explained or clarified at the end, making the fragmentation of the narrative another tool to multiply questions that might be answered or not in the following episode. In my view, it is useful to keep in mind these four features of serial crime narrative when looking at the contemporary true crime docu-series, as this form explicitly built on these elements. True crime shows has always been a staple in television programming, even though in many different forms. And during the last few decades, the proliferation of specialized channels on true crime and later online streaming platforms led to a boom in the production of these kind of programs. But what we have witnessed during the last 5 or 7 years has led to some development in the genre that have brought significant quantitative and qualitative changes. Today, not only can we find a variety of true crime shows on the major TV channels and streaming services, but we are a witness to the success of a specific serial form, which is the docu-series. Here you see a few covers, posters for some docu-series, mostly from Netflix, but not only The Keepers was one, Don't Fuck with Cats also were mentioned yesterday, but there's really plenty. And these are also the most famous, most discussed on internet and also by critics and scholars. According to many commentators, the current trend seems to have started or become visible between 2014 and 2015, where 3 American true crime series created and distributed by authors, companies, and media rather different from each other achieved an unprecedented global popularity, obtaining a certain critical acclaim as well as a real impact on American popular culture and even the public sphere more broadly. These works are the online podcast serial written and interpreted by Sarah Koenig for the American Public Radio NPR and released between December 2014 and January 2014. Then the New York Times bought this franchise and produced 2 more seasons of the podcast. The docu-series Jinx, broadcast by HBO at the beginning of 2015, which is directed by Andrew Jarecki, who was already well known for the true crime documentary Capturing the Friedmans, and Making a Murderer, which was directed by Maura Menos and Laura Ricciardi for Netflix, and has gone to its 2nd season that was released in 2018. So the podcast serial explores the case of a teenager in Baltimore who was found guilty in the early 2000s for the murder of his girlfriend. The explicit goal of the podcast was to prove the innocence of this guy. It led to the reopening of the case and to several appeals to court for the last several years, although at the end, the sentence was not reversed. But it became a real important popular culture phenomenon, as well led to real advances in the process. The Jinx, on the contrary, is focused on an interview with Robert Durst, the son of a powerful New York businessman who had been accused to have killed 3 people between the early 1980s and the early 2000s, but had found guilty for many doubts, despite the doubt, for many decades, despite the doubts of mainstream media. What is most noticeable about the Jinx is that in the last few minutes of the last episode, Robert Durst ends up confessing his guilt without realizing to be recorded by the director. Sorry for the spoiler, but actually it's very interesting because this led to the reopening of the case. And by pure coincidence, 2 weeks ago, he was finally found guilty after 40 years from his first crime, and at least 20, 25 years, he had become a public figure chased by both prosecutors and media. Making a Murderer deals with the unbelievable case of a man who spent 18 years in prison for a rape he had never committed, was finally found innocent, liberated, and then arrested again 2 years later, accused of murder on the basis of an investigation that the series wants to prove was deeply manipulated by the police and local prosecutors with a clear goal of finding him guilty. The global success of the first season of the docu-series contributed to bring attention on the case and new attempts to reverse the sentence, which are detailed in the 2nd season, which follows a lawyer who tries to, many lawyers, in fact, to also building on the success of the first season, try to reverse the sentence. This didn't go through, which is a topic in true crime, as we were saying, either the serial killer or the innocent guy accused by the system seems to be, as we also heard yesterday, from Alice, I think, a recurring theme of this genre. Certainly also as a result of the enormous success of this series, a variety of other docu-series started to be produced, promoted, and discussed online, leading to other big hits. I showed some of the pictures before. Among others, I signal here only 3, 2 additional Netflix series and 1 produced by Amazon. So Wild Wild Country, which obtained important awards and introduced a theme to become quite popular in the genre, the topic of cults and their gurus. Tiger King, whose unbelievable character and chaotic exploitative style led to one of Netflix's fastest and biggest global hits right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, which also contributed both to the popularity of Tiger King and the docu-series probably genre more broadly. And Ted Bundy, Foley for a Killer, a recent production with which Amazon Studios obtained a good success in the genre, recounting once again the story of one of the most famous American serial killer, even though from a different perspective, that of his victims. So to prove how this show fits in the very well-known history of true crime, I will simply go back to the four features of serial crime narratives that I discussed early on. This new wave of true crime is the result of the arrival of new media and their particular modes of production, distribution, and consumption. The digital podcast, the streaming platform, and even the relatively more traditional cable TV channels such as HBO, which, however, when they focus on true crime, provided a new venue for this genre, and as I will say later, a legitimation of the genre itself. The docu-series becomes therefore another example of the ability of serial crime narratives to adapt to new media contexts, as well as the ability of these media to use the genre to attract new viewers or to make their existing audiences addicted to new kinds of serial content. The second element, these recent shows are also a perfect example of the ability of serial crimes to combine actual facts and narrative strategies coming for popular fiction, as they all promise to offer a heightened experience of real life events narrated in a highly engaging way. As is typical of true crime, the way in which the events are told is obviously more important than the events itself. Moreover, these docu-series explicitly present themselves as self-reflexive, both stylistically and performatively, meaning in the way they act in reality, and they constantly show themselves as acting on the process, on the case, on the characters, the real people they deal with. On the one hand, the various kinds of found footage which is used in this series is reworked in very conscious and aesthetically interesting ways, both to enhance the audience's emotional participation and to reflect about media representations of real crimes. On the other hand, this series often intend and sometimes succeed in intervening in the real life issues, cases that they examine, as I said. The third element, all of these series, even when they focus on very dramatic stories, have the real center in their protagonists, that is, the real people that they represent. The actual goal is the portrayal of the main figure, usually the criminal, and or other minor figures such as the victims, the prosecutors, or lawyers, who tell the audience about their relationship with the main character. In true crime, not coincidentally, as I said, the most popular figure has always been the serial killer, whose gruesome action titillate the curiosity of the audience, but whose troubled personality, or subjectivity, I would say actually, represent the real attraction. In this sense, the true crime docu-series simply adds these real people to the gallery of criminal anti-heroes that mark the recent history of TV seriality in the US and elsewhere. Fourth and last, all these docu-series, which should be called more properly as just docu-serials, specifically emphasize the fragmentary, contained, but potentially open-ended form that I discussed before. First of all, they use the serial form to break down a single story that could have been told in a single argument, article, book, or installment. And they expand the original material by creating a series of subsection episode installments, highlighting the interaction with strong cliffhangers to make the narrative more complex and engaging as possible. Secondly, they usually use a short form, like 4-6 episodes have become the normal format of the series. Thirdly, they do not promise to reveal the whole truth. Often they renounce to provide an ultimate judgment of what really happened, about the guilt. Sometimes they also pretend to say that they don't know, they don't think if the protagonist is guilty or not, and they are accused of manipulating the audience. But the point is that they try to leave the question as open as possible, as I said before, in order to stimulate the engagement from the audience. So like Tiger King, which is the trashiest one of this, however, ends with an additional special episode with interviews with the real people that are asked questions also by the audience who have different opinions about whether they are guilty or not. So it's a kind of a talk show about the series to decide who's right and wrong, and the audience is totally elicited to participate in this debate. If this all simply reiterates something that serial crime narratives has always offered, there is also something specific about the docu-series. This phenomenon is one of the consequences of the changes in the television and media system that have occurred during the last 20 years and led to the enormous commercial and critical success of what has been called by TV scholars such as Robert Thompson, Janet McCabe, Kim McCass, and Jason Mittal, quality or complex television. What these labels indicate is that critics, scholars, and audiences alike started to look at TV series as something culturally legitimate and, as a matter of fact, as the central phenomenon in contemporary media culture. I want to point out especially that in the case of true crime narratives, we are witnessing to a particular reversal in the way in which the relationship between seriality and crime narratives usually worked out. While this link has been traditionally seen as yet another proof of why crime narratives were aesthetically, ethically, and politically questionable, particularly in the case of true crime, turning tragic events in serialized spectacle, with the contemporary true crime docu-series, we witnessed the use of seriality as a way to try and obtain cultural legitimation for true crime. This is not a coincidence. Sarah Koenig, the author of the podcast Serial, has explicitly declared that the model for her work were the TV series that audiences and critics have been celebrating for the previous 15 or 20 years. Before directing The Jinx, as I said, Andrzej Jarecki was an author, was the director of an Oscar-nominated true crime documentary, and then a feature film with Ryan Gosling and Kirsten Dunst, telling the very same story later explored in his HBO docu-series. His trajectory from documentary to fictional cinema to TV series released by the most prestigious cable TV channel clearly manifests this peculiar parallel process of serialization and legitimation of the true crime. In this sense, when Netflix accepted to co-produce Making a Murderer and then invest heavily in the genre, it was simply proving how true crime had now found its place in the context of contemporary so-called quality television. So-called contemporary quality television. Above all, what this means is that both these texts and the context in which they appeared have been prepared to readapt the themes and the style of true crime to a new phase in which the narrativization of criminal stories do not only aim at increasing the sensational effect, but also at offering an ethically acceptable treatment of the topic, a social commitment to the non-serious problem in the judicial system, and even to highlight some structural social inequalities on a more general level. Yes, it won't be too late. So the last part, given these premises, it might become clear why I chose to point your attention on a docu-series like SanPa. That is the first work in this genre produced by, in Italy, by the streaming platform Netflix. And in fact, SanPa was not only the first docu-series to get mainstream attention in Italy, but was the very first product in general produced by Netflix that got mainstream attention, showing that Netflix is something more than an online video store addressing young audiences interested in American and foreign TV series. It competed with mainstream media, newspaper, TV, all talked about SanPa for a few weeks. But it really became a huge thing, wide beyond the bubble of TV fans, TV series fans, etc. This is also related to the second series of my choice of the question of the relationship between quality TV and true crime docu-series relates to why I chose SanPa as a series, despite the fact that it's not a true crime TV series. To be sure, the show features more than one crime, various mysteries, several trials, some investigative journalism. But its theme and overall approach did not allow us to firmly include SanPa in the category of true crime. In reality, SanPa deals with an important social problem, the heroin epidemic in Italy during the late 1970s and early 1980s, the nationwide media and political impact of this crisis, and the controversial figures and actions of Vincenzo Muccioli, which is the guy you see in most of these pictures, the founder of the famous rehabilitation community San Patrignano. All of this makes it rather different from a pure true crime show. And yet I think that SanPa can be an ideal topic to conclude my reflection on serial crime narratives in general and the links between true crime and serial documentary in particular for this very reason. By making implicit and explicit references to the true crime genre, SanPa simultaneously proves its ambition to be received as something more than sensational entertainment, and also reveals how true crime is now a section of the culturally legitimate system of quality online television, non-linear television, which can be used both as a commercial strategy and as an appropriate means to bring some social and political themes to the attention of a wider audience. So to give you something more to understand what I will say to conclude my talk, I really want to show you the trailer because you have no idea what I'm talking about, even of the big, I mean, we know of San Patrignano since the 80s. It has been a huge political issue in Italy for 40 years. So when SanPa was released, although a lot of his young viewers had never heard of it, for people a bit older, San Patrignano was a huge topic in the 80s and 90s and so on. Vincenzo Muccioli died in 1995, which is why the younger generation never heard of him. But the impact on the issue of drugs and so on is much wider than that. So I believe that this trailer can already suggest how the idea of quality true crime docu-series that I've discussed before can help us understand what kind of show SanPa is. The four features of serial crime narratives that I previously discussed. Here, there are a few information about the show, which, however, is produced by some not well-known people at all, but people that clearly works in the cultural media industries. I've been working in the cultural media industry for 20 years, and they jumped on the format of the docu-series. Then they use Netflix as a way to clearly explain, to use it in an effective way. The four features of serial crime narratives that I previously discussed are almost clearly visible already in the trailer. SanPa is presented as a documentary that is somehow different from traditional TV programs on the same topic. To some extent, the trailer looks much more like that of a film than a TV show. There's no explicit mention to its serial format, which is interesting. However, the fact that this is a Netflix production is constantly reminded to the viewer, stressing how it is something adapted to new forms of consumption preferred by younger audiences, the same who might have appreciated Make It a Murder, Wild Wild Country, or Tiger King. The style of the trailer, from the editing to the music to the use of dialogues and written text, turns the actual events and their social political relevance into a mystery drama, an ethical questioning about the figure and the action of Muccioli, making it immediately comparable to a crime or a political novel, or a criminal political crime novel. The focus on the character is, of course, obvious in the emphasis on the figure of Muccioli. And equally important are the various former guests of SanPa, whose personal stories, memories, and words are the real emotional and intellectual center of this documentary. SanPa is indeed, first of all, the presentation of a group of people to the viewer who can choose their perspective on the facts told in the series according to the different version that each of these person gives us about Muccioli, about their experience, and so on. While the highly serialized structure of the show is not visible in the trailer, you can guess how all the mystery and the questions surrounding Muccioli and SanPa have been treated for dramatic effects. In this table, you can see, if you could read, it's basically, it's the structure of the series as the writer have explained. They built each of these episodes. Each of the episodes is constructed according to the same formula, adopting a 4-act model, an intro, and the conclusion that is a cliffhanger. And if you could read the details, it explains exactly how they were building block by block a totally addictive series, which is both fascinating and a bit disturbing. What is most obvious, finally, is how the a docu-series such as this confirms the impression that the recent success of true crime is linked to the legitimation of TV seriality in general and crime dramas in particular. As commentators have noticed, both in a positive and negative way, it is difficult to think of SanPa without linking it to previous true crime series, as it shares many of their themes as well as their formal features. The use of the docu-series to intervene in the public debate, that the treatment of topics such as cult and sect groups and their manipulative leaders, the careful adoption of the narrative and the static strategies of true crime shows are perfectly in line with series such as The Jinx or Making a Murder and the other that I mentioned. While I can go on in depth about the reception of the series, which is also why I started to be interested in the series in particular, I just wanted to mention before closing my talk that despite the universal praise received from mainstream media, SanPa has become the object of a lively and very interesting debate of smaller cultural and academic and political communities. In this context, the series has also been criticized for its most obvious use of strategies of popular serial crime narratives, as they draw attention away from the broader political and historical contents in which the events depicted actually took place. And they focus the attention on they emphasize the individual stories of both the people, the former drug addicts and Muccioli himself. From this perspective, even if SanPa was able to shed light on a controversial phenomenon, stimulating critical view from the audience, the series ultimately failed in providing all the elements necessary to really enable the audience to elaborate a deeper understanding of the structural historical, social reason leading to the problems, the heroin epidemic in the late 1970s Italy, and 12 to the false solutions that Sampartiniano was providing to this problem. While I'm aware that this is just a starting point for my new research, both on true crime in particular and the serialization of crime narratives more broadly, I hope this presentation has provided at least a few premises that you could find understanding, and maybe you can give me some feedback to go beyond this. And I stop here, so we have more. Thank you.